So we'll do this as Monday nights are usually done. We'll begin with meditation, and then I'll have a few words, and then we'll talk. And so we want to begin by taking refuge. Normally, of course, we seek refuge in things that eventually will let us down, things that are impermanent. Going for pleasure, and that passes. Going for praise, and that passes. Likes, wealth, something in the bank, that ebbs away, and the other things. So we want to take refuge here in our Buddha nature, which is to say, taking refuge in the inherent spaciousness, openness of mind, without boundary, without preferences, without east or west. Open, empty, inconceivable presence. In that we take refuge in our Dharma kaya, the knowing of our openness, of our vastness, our unconditioned presence, within which we also take refuge in our open heart, unbound, undefended, at peace. Practicing tonight for the benefit of ourselves and others, in order to be a somewhat clearer channel, to be of some help in this world. And so with that, let your awareness just settle into itself, into your body, into your breathing body. Inhabiting your breath all the way down to the bottom of the belly and all the way out into the emptiness of space. Inhabiting the breath, feeling those sensations of breathing. Particularly in the belly, with those big lungs. But also noticing how this breathing ripples throughout the entire body, throughout the chest cavity. And the neck, oxygenating the blood to the brain, letting the awareness permeate the head and the neck and the chest. Noticing wherever you're holding tensions, perhaps in the neck or perhaps in the shoulders. Breathing into those areas, exhaling, release. the head, the neck, the chest. Soft eyes, easy in their sockets. Relaxed jaw. Open throat. Tender heart. Soft belly. Breathing in and out of this core. And also attuning to how the energy likewise flows to the extremities, the arms and the hands and the legs, to the soles of the feet. Coming home. Inhabiting the sentience of your body. Sensations of the physical body. Letting this be enough. To breathe, to sense, feeling already the richness of simply sensing. Tuning into this quality of energy, the feeling body, the energy body, which will often settle around the belly, flow from the belly. So tuning in to that emotional tone, the felt sense you find present with you today. Maybe there's a dominant feeling, or maybe there's a mixture. Breathing into that. Exhaling, releasing on whatever holding you may find in the subtle body, in the physical body. Any tensions that you encounter. letting your awareness stream through the body in its own way as your attention is drawn to some particular area that needs your attention, that could use your gentle touch. Give it that touch. Inhabiting the physical body, inhabiting the feeling body. Allowing whatever thoughts arise to arise without blocking them. But likewise, letting them go their own way without feeding them, without traveling from the here and the now. Immersing yourself in the inner pulse of your being. If you wish, tune in, open up to whatever's niggling, unsettled, difficult, painful for you just now. Nothing to think about here. Rather feel in, tune in under the story about it, into how it's lodged in there, how it holds you, how you're holding it. Breathing in, letting your awareness more deeply saturate this thing. Maybe it's an old friend who does not always behave as a good friend, but it's been with you a while. Breathe into the fullness of it, the all and the everything. Opening yourself to yourself. Allowing whatever inner barriers to relax. Notice how the unsettled, maybe a wound, will just naturally draw your awareness to it. You don't have to do anything. The system wants to heal. It may just take some time. So for a few moments, let's give it that time. Nothing to accomplish. If there's nothing particularly difficult for you just now, enjoy the ease. But if there is something there, breathe a little more deeply into it. Into the whole of it. And exhale, release also on the whole of it. Letting your breath work a bit like the tide. Going in, going out, as a kind of inner cleansing, inner massage. Metabolizing what needs to be metabolized. Thawing out what needs to be thawed. Loosening what has been tightened. Breathing into the tight, into the hard. Breathing out the loose, the lilt, the light. releasing the light that has been endarkened somehow. This very gentle rhythm of breathing. And now emphasize a bit more the exhale, the letting go, the surrender, the release. Opening. Releasing into spacious, empty, open awareness. There may be a brief pause there before the next inhale. Rest in that pause. Feeling the empty, the open. And then notice how all of it, the sensations, the feelings, the thoughts, are all within the openness of awareness. Belong to it in the way that the clouds belong to the sky. The way the clouds dissipate into sky-like awareness. Giving yourself to that. Not anything. But is the nature, the being of everything. Bodhicitta. Open, sky-like, Buddha nature. Letting everything dissolve into this constantly sheltering awareness. everything moves through thoughts, sensations, feelings. Always changing. Sky-like awareness never changes. Omnipresent, vast, imperceptible, inconceivable, undeniable. Sitting here as we are, allow all your sense doors to also be open and flow, including the eyes. Sounds come and go, color and form also. There's nothing to protect or be embarrassed about. Befriending every little thing. Relaxing into that friendliness that's being as such. That basic goodness, the inherent beauty of your natural mind, open heart. What the Buddha discovered. What we can discover. For those of you on Zoom, that was the sound of one bell ringing. Are you done meditating now? Or are you continuing? Only just au naturel. Saraha was a Mahasiddha in India. He wasn't particularly a Buddhist, but he was quite enlightened, quite awakened. And he observed the open, delightful spontaneity of our nature, of Buddha mind, flows unimpeded like water flows. Being free, the mind can also become unfree. And not flow. And get caught up in its own constructions, its own reactions. And freeze into a position of self versus the world versus other. And feel the need for protection from an unkind, unacknowledging, uncaring world. And so, quite reasonably, feel the need to defend itself from slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. Sometimes, most often, I'm afraid, from the people that are most precious to us, who have in fact given us birth. Because, of course, they're in the same predicament. Can't help it. Have frozen their own minds into reactive formations, compulsive thinking, being for and against. And so we enter this conditioned world, create our defense structures, and then the mind then becomes dominated by what it wants versus it doesn't. And these famous worldly concerns, where we feel in order to have some kind of peace and joy, we want to pursue pleasure and avoid pain, pursue praise and avoid blame, pursue gain and avoid loss, pursue likes and avoid being unliked or bad reputations. These 8, we live our lives bouncing between the two sides of these, our entire life, striving for this and avoiding the other thing. And so, being conditioned, and Saraha notes, water has turned into ice. We've become hardened for the best of reasons, with the best of intentions, doing our very best to salvage some kind of self-esteem, some kind of happiness, some kind of sense of empowerment. In an otherwise a situation where we lack power, we've been doing our best. Nevertheless, the water has turned into ice. And so we then decide we want to do something about it. rather than the usual things, the usual refuges, which everybody's doing, like I just said, trying to get more of this or less of the other thing. Always impermanent, always temporary. Even when we get what we want, we'll lose it. Love. Stuff. It doesn't turn out exactly how we hoped. So then some people get savvy and realize that trying to change our conditions is not going to totally work. It may give us a little breathing room, but we begin to suspect that the cause of our suffering is more or as much inside as it is outside. And because even when we change our conditions, then we still wind up getting disappointed. So there are some people who then decide to work on themselves. And then we begin to, through that, begin to realize it's not so much what happens or what happened to us. The more important thing is how we've taken what's happened to us and how we're living forward what's happened to us. That's the thing we have control over. The circumstances, well, who knows what's going to happen? But how we surf them, well, now we want to improve our capacity, our ability to more elegantly, more compassionately, more skillfully, more intelligently move with the past that we have embodied, ingrained into a future where that doesn't any longer so much dominate us. We want to be free. And so we begin a practice. Normally it's hard to do that. It's hard to look in because the waves of our mind are so churned up with doings, stimulation, old hauntings from the past, aspirations for the future. So we live our life between memories and anticipations, aspirations. So we need to first of all collect ourselves so that we can calm these waves that are getting churned up by these winds of karma. So like a pond with waves, you can't see, even a star-studded sky with those waves, the surface is too agitated. You can't see any of these potentialities, our positive potentialities. So once that surface gets calmed down and still, just like, a lake in the morning, a still morning, it can reflect all of the stars if it's still night, or if it's daybreak, then it reflects so well, doesn't it? All those trees and maybe rocks that are around it as a lucid mirror. So we do our best to look inside, and we then encounter our holdings. And so from a psychological perspective, we can talk about things like our holdings, like our depressions, our anxieties, our obsessive thinking. So we want to cool all of those things. Want to lift those depressions, calm those anxieties. So we use the word that makes sense of healing. This is a psychological language. But it also fits with the Dharma, the original Dharma. The understanding is that we are the patient. And the illness are poisons. There's a way we're poisoned, and we're poisoning ourselves with aggression, infatuation, fear, arrogance, envy. We have these poisons. And so we are the patient. And so we go to the doctor, we go to maybe a hospital, like a retreat, or a Dharma gathering. And there we consult a physician, the Buddha. And then the Buddha prescribes our treatment, the Dharma. Now, the difference between like a psychological understanding and a dharmic understanding is that the doctor can't heal us. We have to do that for ourselves. So there is this kind of medical metaphor in basic Buddhism. So I think it's fair to use this way of thinking about the path and about our practice as a process of healing. It has some integrity to it with the Dharma. Traditionally, the Buddhist psychology will use different language. It'll use language like obscurations, defilements. Well, these are the same things. They're the core problem. We can say depression, but if we look into depression, what do we find? We find that we're hanging on to some dark story about ourself. We're putting ourselves down in our own mind. We're literally pushing ourselves down, depressing ourselves. And you find that runaround, don't you? If you know depression, then you know what I'm talking about. Negative waves, negative storylines, aversion. So the Buddha psychology just goes to the crux of it. Aversion, attachment, indifference. These are the bugaboos. These are the things that we need to release. We could say purify. We could say heal. So we can use different language. We've got to find language that works, because it's tricky for us, given our self-centeredness, the self-centeredness of our time, of our age. And so we can blame ourselves. It's tricky. We say obscurations, defilements. We can go, oh, bad me. And if we have this kind of Christian thing on top of that, then we got original sin, and it just sticks up the works. So we want to find the meaning of what the Buddha taught, and then find the language that accords to the meaning, rather than getting caught in language that doesn't quite work for us because it's kind of old. And it was spoken at a different time in a different context. And if you've ever been to places in the third world, in a simpler time, in a simpler place, closer to the earth, I've been to a few, like places like Tibet or Peru, places, Nepal, places where it's not so complicated. Even people who are dirt poor have a happiness, have a resilience, have a well-being. They're not so crazy. When I was first in India, I was practicing a therapist at the time, and I just thought, I would be absolutely useless here. It's not neurosis. These people need shelter, medical care, right? It's something not the sophisticated illnesses that we have that are so rampant. So we begin to look in, begin to take responsibility for ourselves, and begin to have a pause before our reaction through having a practice, not only going to a talk, but developing a practice. The more that we do that, the more that we realize that's really important, because we can go to a talk and be inspired. We can go to retreats and have a big breakthrough. But then the retreat's over, and we cruise for a while. And then the old stuff creeps back in. So we realize we need to have an ongoing practice, a daily practice. We need more sanity, because otherwise our mind is busy with its illness, with its insanity, striving for this, avoiding that and the other thing. So Saraha says, seeing that we're not stuck, that we have a choice. We don't have to be reactive. We can pause and consider before we act. This is the human power. This is the human strength in the human realm. Harder for animals. They just react. Instinct. Us, we can pause. We have a choice. So the more that we calm the waters of our psyche, and the more we can see what's going on, rather than only see through our reactive vision, then we can act more skillfully. And then, as Saraha says, we understand that ice actually is water. What has seemed to be only hard actually is soft in us. We have soft spot, as Trungpa put it. Soft spot. We're vulnerable, sensitive. Where we get hurt, the feeling of our pain, the sensitivity is our strength, if we can bear it. And we don't either push it away or react to stop whatever the assault is. If we can find a way of befriending and relating. So we discover ice is water. And then we keep going. We develop a more serious practice. We begin to be more comfortable in our depths, in our bellies, with our core wounds, we would say in a psychological language. We touch and go at first. We can't do much. It's just too hot to handle. It's too bad. It's too painful. So we begin with touch and go. That's the way. Just touch and go. We don't touch and stay. And force, not so helpful. Because if we do that, then it's very probable that we'll eventually have had enough freaking meditation. And we'll have to leave. And this happens. People stop practicing because it's just too hard. So we want to find a little flex, touch and go. But then by and by, then we can go a little deeper. And we can befriend the tougher stuff. The deeper holdings. And our practice deepens. And things begin to dissolve. And then we begin to see, I'm not who I think I am. I maybe don't know exactly who I am, but I'm not who I think I am. There's an openness to me. So this is the stage, as Saraha says, where now ice is melting into water. At first we just have an insight, we just have a data point, we just know it more intellectually. But then we start to have more and more the felt experience where ice is melting into water. And this has to do with our practice more deeply saturating our system. So through this process, we're in a process of, we could say, self-improvement. We're feeding more positive qualities like loving kindness and compassion and equanimity and joy. And we're trying to avoid and not give energy to our dark side, our despair, our hatred, our fear, our aggressions of various kinds. So we're on a developmental process. We could say purification, healing, self-improvement. This is all relative to our circumstance. And so when we get to the Vajrayana, we say that there's two aspects. One is the path of development, where we accumulate merit. This is the language that's used. What that means is we're cultivating these qualities of self-compassion and compassion for others and equanimity and courage and kindness. And so we're becoming somebody who we like more than we did before. So we could say accumulating merit, but we can also say more deeply befriending. Something like this. The process of healing is this process of warming up to ourselves such that we can let our light shine. We're not so defended anymore. We can take more risks in opening up and letting our more awakened qualities radiate. Be not so self-centered. And then we're more giving. And then, of course, we find out we like that. We feel better. So all of this is this process of ice is in the process of melting into water. So this development stage is also a stage of increasing self-understanding, understanding why we do the things we do, understanding also how to apply remedies to buffer our reactive mind so we become less reactive and more responsive, increasing our ability to respond. So now we're talking about genuine responsibility, rather than the kind that, we're conforming to. And in a gradual way, we begin to see that the openness, the spaciousness, the peacefulness is more who we are than the reactive stuff. So now in the Vajrayana sense, there's the path of development. Now there's the path of accomplishment, or the path of perfection. We begin to have more data points if we touch into our innate perfection. That isn't me, but is the thing that allows for me, the awareness, the heartfulness, the openness. And so our center of gravity begins to shift. To that more spacious, more inclusive awareness. So as tranquil, non-conceptual awareness stabilizes. So this again is where deepening practice is so important, because it's one thing to have a glimpse of open, a glimpse of our Buddha nature, but as we know, that will pass. We want to have more glimpses. We want to have them more frequently. And when we have them, then, if we're drawn to a path, a direct path, then it's a different kind of practice. Not so much self-observation anymore, self-examination or self-improvement, but a practice of enjoyment, a practice of relaxing into our natural mind, not the fabricating thinking mind, but the mind at rest. We want to become more stable, at rest in our non-construing, non-fabricating, non-conceptualizing, non-imagining, au natural situation. And so, as tranquil, non-conceptual awareness stabilizes, memory dissolves into non-memory, and appearances, anticipations, dissolve into intrinsic openness. So we can talk about it, but we want to see, is that true? Because normally we see objects. We're in here and everything else is out there. It has colors, it has forms, we like it, we don't. And it seems like two different things, right? Dualistic vision. We live in this 24/7 mostly. But we can see that actually that's a fabrication. We're doing that. And if we stop doing and we relax into non-doing, non-action, into being, and we develop more the capacity for tolerating openness, for tolerating being as such. Now, we go beyond the need for healing, beyond efforts of doing, of accomplishing. And just this is unconditional bliss, Mahasukha, says Saraha. This is like ice having turned into water. So, on the healing part, there's something to be done. There's effort that's required. Diligence, concentration, mindfulness, moral integrity, so we don't make matters worse. There's a variety of very helpful factors that we are cultivating, and other ones, bad habits, we're trying to not cultivate and let those go. But then upon recognizing, intuiting the spacious nature of mind, that practice shifts. And now we don't want to do anything at that moment. Rather, we want to relax. So now, this is the path of awakening, path of accomplishment. Accumulation, it's an accumulation of wisdom. That's really not such, there's nothing accumulating, it's more like tolerating, stabilizing ourselves in open, unconditional presence. So there are these two, and there's no reason in the world why we can't do both. In order to do the more open one, well, we do have to have access. So if we're not there, or we're not dependably there, well then we need to work and heal and not pretend we're what all is one. That's not so helpful for us or the people within our blast radius. But if we are there, then we also don't need to give energy to the consensus reality. whatever that is between people. We don't have to keep up our end of the charade, of the security arrangement we have with someone. We let ourselves, this is not so easy, because there's love at stake here, right, in a relationship. And so we have the choice, do we hold on? Possessive love. Or do we let go, allowing for the difference in the space between the openness, which is, of course, the core of love, doesn't put demands on anybody. And can we tolerate that insecurity? The insecurity of being untethered, unbound, free. This is a horse of a different color. So both healing and wakeful awareness. We can play with these. This is the Vajrayana approach I'm presenting here. It also will work with the Mahayana. Okay, that's what I had to say. So, as people are noticing, this is also a worthwhile time if you have to, go to the bathroom or something. But if you don't, then we're still here, but we can keep going. So, now it's open to other voices.
Just a reminder, this is Jen with the mic. If people in this room would like to have a moment to share, we use the microphone so that the folks who are on Zoom can hear what's happening in this room. And hopefully the screens can go on in a minute and we'll see the other participants. So please feel free to raise a hand, both in this room and on Zoom also, and I'll pass the mic. Great. And start with your name and hold it close.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Colby. Thank you so much for sharing. I just love meeting or knowing people like you that are out there, because so many of my friends that are of your generation that met the Lamas early on, kind of helping people to chew and digest all this material is pretty cool. Because my last 20 years of being involved in different Dharma centers, people fall away by the wayside, not because of a new job or family or anything so much in the world, but their own self-defacing attitude. And really it's been a lot of their own self-defacing attitude.
Yeah.
And so having friends who are more kind of inclined to having a healthy ego in order to let go that a lot of our Western psychology can help with has been really nice. So thanks for performing that role. It's just been fun being on the sidelines, watching friends like you help other friends like over the last 20 years. It's been pretty cool. So thanks for being one of them.
So, are you a millennial then?
I don't know how these terms work. 1980 I was born. Is that close-ish?
80?
Yeah, 80 baby.
Close.
Close-ish.
Close. Yeah, so you're next.
Ah, yeah.
You're on deck.
Oh, well, just live long. You don't have to. Thank you. Yeah. Well, yeah, thanks for sharing.
Yeah. Thank you, Colby.
Thank you.
Great. Hold it close. Start with your name.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm John. I'd like to hear a little bit more about what you called it rest. In your book, in the last exercise, where you're seeing something, and you turn around and you see whoever's seeing, and then you get it, and then you rest. And you talked a little bit about that here tonight. And when I first first encountered that, I wasn't quite sure what we were talking about. I mean, I'm pretty sure you don't mean go take a nap. But, how do you rest, and aren't you right on back into your monkey mind, just taken off, and you have to bring it back?
Well, don't discourage a nap. So there's a variety of entry points, and in Dzogchen there's a number of entry points. And so in that book, I just kind of go through, it's kind of like cradle to the grave in terms of skillful means. So that's pretty advanced. At the end, I get to the most advanced stuff. But let's stick with a nap for the minute. So naps, you take a nap, you're taking a nap. So notice that, like a decent nap, like a half hour at least, right? And maybe you're not really dreaming, but you really are resting already. But it's a nap, and so your mind's wandering, different things. But then the system is nevertheless rested. And so then you decide to get up. Like maybe you're on your sofa. It's the afternoon. And so you get up. At that moment, notice your state of mind. Right? This notice who's noticing. Because there won't be a lot of mind development. And you're in a shift from lying down now to sitting up. And so you have to kind of be aware of what you're doing, right? So you don't fall off the sofa, right? So the mind is alert, but since it's rested, it's been emptied a bit. It's a calmer. That would be one place, where you might notice, let awareness recognize itself. So that's a possibility. Now, a much more conducive possibility is to go on a retreat. Then the odds get stacked, in our favor, because the circumstances of a retreat are so calming and immersive that they're more conducive to having glimpses of what can't be described. Because that's what we're talking about. What we're talking about is indescribable, inconceivable, imperceptible. Normally we want to perceive things with our senses. We've got the 5, and then we got the big kahuna, number 6, the mind, which has mental objects. And so we want to practice this calming first, so that we can get the ripples on the mind's surface smooth. Then we're more able to see what can't be seen. But it's here right now. Has always been here. Has never been created, has never been born, can never die. How does that sound?
Sounds great. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, the Buddha had his 2 days under the tree. First, it was all the Maras attacked, and then he let them, and then he realized what happens when you do that, when you open up, they release on their own. Whoa! In that wake of sky-like presence, then the second day, the latent powers, the Buddhic potentialities then emerge, like foresight, the knowing of other minds, the future, the past. This spaciousness of awareness, not of a self, of awareness, then that got released. So this happened to him. And then he thought, well, cool. Nobody's going to get it. So I'm just going to go into the forest and just enjoy. Because no one's going to get it. Because it isn't anything of the senses, of the mind, of concept. Doesn't have words you couldn't say. It's way bigger than that. In the same way that space is way bigger than the stars that are in it here and there, boom, boom, here and there, boom, boom. Meanwhile, space, the final frontier. Couldn't say where it begins, space. Couldn't say where it ends. Couldn't say where it has a center. It's the universal metaphor for the nature of our mind. The only way to see it is to see it. We say see, but we use a sense because we have senses. We're sentient beings. So we use that word, see, because it's our most powerful sense, the vision. But it's a metaphor. It's seen not with these two eyes. It's seen with a third eye. It's another eye. We can experience it, even if we can't describe it. Hence, the importance of practice.
I have a question about the importance of challenging. Oh, I'm Vivian. Of challenging the state of well-being. In other words, I had a friend who was a Buddhist, an elder, and his mother was murdered in prison in China, and he escaped with the Dalai Lama over the mountains, and he was very angry, and he, with the Dalai Lama as his teacher, he overcame all of his anger. And other things. I had a parrot, and the parrot didn't like him because I think I was paying too much attention to him. And the parrot went up to him and bit his ear, split it like almost all, like just split it. And he didn't even react. Literally, no reaction. I mean, it was like mind-blowing. So there were things like that that I just knew, that I saw over and over again. So my question, in my case, I've been practicing a long time in various ways, and there's a lot of benefit, and I know that. But my life is so fortunate. Almost as if, you know, the way heaven realms are described or something, like I'm around spiritual teachers and I have all my needs met and I have beauty around me and I have love, and like all those things. And I'm wondering, and then I'm feeling really good, right? And I'm wondering if it's important to challenge, like rather than going on more and more retreats, is it important to put yourself in situations that that could be like friction, or is that not necessary?
Yeah, well, it could be, but it depends, right? As the Indigo Girls put it, truth follows a crooked path. Everyone's path is different, so it can be good to challenge. There's a whole long core tradition in Tibet on practicing the chud, going into terrifying places. We would call them charnel grounds. Graveyards doesn't do it. They're fearsome places, sometimes where bodies have also been hacked up, other places where they're not been totally buried, and they're very scary places. And so you go there to practice because it's challenging. And so those practitioners do that for exactly that purpose. They're trained for it, and they have their damaru drum, and they have their bell, maybe they have a thigh bone trumpet, and they're just incredibly fierce warriors. So there's a place for that, but then we also, I think, have to be aware, like, is it the heart's desire? If we tune into our inner guidance system, that wee small voice, we just got to tune right into the depth of that. What does that say for us to do? Because there's also a way that we can kind of have, as it were, white person's shame. And feel like, oh, our circumstances are so lovely here, and other people are suffering, and back of that, I don't deserve it. Back of that, something wrong with me. So if we start looking, we say, oh, there's something else motivating. It's not this courageous voice. It's more of a shame voice. It's more of a not good enough voice. So that's very important to discern and to see. Because the truth is, given the world condition, we are in a good situation, aren't we? Here. I mean, right now we have it mixed. And, the empire, of course, is eroding. But right at this moment, we're free. We have optimal circumstances in the human realm. We have our health. We have enough money, we have shelter, we have the Dharma, we have the full range of the Dharma. We have our own motivation to practice the Dharma. A lot of people are in our situation, but they don't have the motivation to practice the Dharma. And even people who have the motivation to practice the Dharma, they're not necessarily drawn to the main point. They're more drawn to the healing part rather than the awakening part, the preliminary stuff, the self-development, the self-improvement part, and not the actualization part, which is more challenging. It is tougher. Not everyone's drawn. You gotta be true. We have to be true. If we're not true to our inner guidance, then we're going to screw up. Right? As the poet says, what your soul prefers is that you fail at living your own life rather than succeed at living somebody else's. So we got to track from the heart.
Hi, I'm Gwen. I don't have any problem coming up with things in life that are challenging. I don't have to go to the charnel grounds or whatever you call them. I wonder if you might speak a little bit about, because it's on my mind with the news in France and Spain, and I used to work in natural resources. If you could speak about climate change, and because it's a downer for me a lot, and I wonder how maybe you tangle with that.
We're talking about karma, the law of karma here. There's a consequence. Causes have their effects. So we know very well with industrialization and with burning carbon fuels. I mean, the planet may have been in a warming phase anyway, right? Because it just goes in and out. But we're, of course, accelerating it to a point of just tragic absurdity. It's heartbreaking, frankly. Me? I find it heartbreaking. And often I find myself, particularly given the political climate in our own country right now, I find myself in moments of helplessness, powerlessness. Mm-hmm. So now that's about me. So there's the karmic consequences that we have inherited, that we have been born into. We didn't do it. We may be contributing. I mean, I drive a regular car. Even if I didn't, if I had an electric car, where does the grid get the electricity from, right? I mean, so this is our dimension. And it makes no sense to create a problem against something we have no chance of solving. And it could be also another form of self-hatred. We think, oh, whatever, I'm contributing. There was a movie about this I recently saw. First Reformed. That was a tough movie. Anyway. So I have a reaction. And so my heartbreak or outrage or whatever it is, now it's another experience. There are many experiences, right? I don't have to go to the charnel ground either. You look around and there's something to process. And so I'm going to get an electric car when I can. So I do my little bit. That's about how I play that. And then before long, my life will be over. I hold no illusions about that. So I'll do what I can. I contribute money to causes that are helping. That's what I can do. And then I don't get. Then I move on. I have grandchildren to think about. I have you guys to think about. There's a lot of things, isn't there?
It's just, for me, it's such a challenge to find a place of peace and acceptance. I think I'm accepting it, maybe. But to have some kind of equanimity and stability around it, that's a challenge.
There's your work.
Do you have any tips?
Well, it sounds like you're going through a grief process, right? There are these stages of grief, right? Denial, anger, bargaining, blah, blah, blah. There's all kind of stages, not just the ones that Kubler-Ross identified. All kinds of things. So you work it. It's a phenomena. Don't block it, right? The practice, let it come up. But also don't hang on. Don't hang on. Exhale. There's a flower blooming next to you as well. Breathe that in too, right? So just regular practice. It's just another phenomena, another appearance. So there's appearances. This is an appearance, an experience. And so we don't hold it, we don't push back, block, And we don't hold on, we let it pass through. And then we can follow that into the spaciousness of the awareness within which the appearance, climate change, even arose.
There was one other aspect that I heard that's been helpful is in conflict, tumult, strife, instability, what you bring to the table, your attitude that you bring to the table can bring calm or can bring more agitation. And so that was helpful for me. There was like a path right there for me. It's like a purpose, something that could really help.
Cool. Yeah, I noticed we're out of time. Aren't we out of time? 7:30, is that when we end?
Yeah. We do have one more question.
Okay, I'm fine with me. I just don't want anyone, I don't want to upset anybody. Going over. My bad habit.
This is Jim. I'm going to give my question observation and then the one that came up in response to her. I feel one of the challenges is I come to a talk like this and I go away feeling like I've achieved a much greater understanding, but it's like the tide. In a couple of days, it's like, when will I hear another talk like that? Because it's not hanging together. But the other one, back to the climate, I do buy into the climate change and so on, but I heard on the radio today an American wildland fire expert who for some reason lives in Germany. I wanted to ask that. But anyway, he said that a big part of the fires is indeed climate change. But he said there's an even bigger factor, and that's the fact that people moved away from the countryside, and the countryside overgrew and didn't have fires. And for a long time in the U.S., the sole philosophy of the Forest Service was put out every fire. And those are two huge contributors, maybe even bigger than climate change. And then even though I buy into climate change, I keep wondering about the Ice Age, which is very real and not so long ago.
Well, I'll just say, yeah, so you're pointing out there's more causes, there's more conditions. Everything's interdependent. And the more you look, the more you find. Anything. The more you look, the more you find. Look at a tree, into the tree. You will see the whole universe if you look far enough. Into a pebble, even. You just keep looking, and everything, knee bone is connected to the hip bone. Everything's connected. So, of course, that's how it is. But in regard to your first question of the tide going out, this is where it can be important to really, the hard answer here is kind of a self-reckoning. And like, where are my priorities? Like, how am I spending my days? Right? So this is a talk. And just to kind of get a sense, am I on course, or could I lean more in another direction? And of course, the direction that I love to lean is more Dharma. So more talks, more readings, more podcasts, more practice. Am I going to watch a Netflix thing, or am I going to read a book, a Dharma book? How am I going to spend my afternoon? Right. So this kind of shifting ourselves from being an ordinary person, following the ordinary worldly concerns, the worldly dharmas, to becoming a Dharma person. I'm not even talking about Buddhism here. I'm talking about Dharma with a small d. Spiritual person. And let that be the defining focus of my life. So when I arrive at the end, and all these things that we've accumulated none of them will matter anymore. They'll all come to nothing. The only thing that will remain is our head space, our heart space. That will continue, our mind stream, if we're going to accept Buddhist psychology, which I do. That we're not just a random collision between some egg and sperm, some materialistic thing. No, we are on an evolutionary course. We've been at this in an unimaginably long time. We're not vegetables. We're not even animals. Unlike the animals, like I mentioned, we have choice. We can pause, like an animal can't. It's just to either fight or flight. We can choose. So to use this intelligence that we have, and to ask this question, to what do I devote my life? This is a question to periodically just ask to that person in the mirror. What are you doing? What are you doing? And then just to be ruthlessly honest. We don't have to tell anybody. It's just between ourselves and ourselves. Anyway.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome, Jim.
Thank you.
Okay, so in a very lickety-split way, we're just going to gather the merit, the goodwill, the sincere intention that we've generated here this evening. And we're going to give all that merit away to the benefit of all beings. May all beings be happy and nourish the causes of happiness. May we be free of suffering and its causes. May we never be parted from happiness, free from sorrow. May all beings be free of attachment, aversion, and indifference, and remain easy in great equanimity, loving kindness, sympathetic joy, and heartfelt compassion. May all beings everywhere be free.